Okay. But because this is actually such an experienced group, I think that what we did in the first session is kind of how I'm going to continue to play it, which is more of this, hey, these are models I use in my practice. Let me show you kind of how I talk about it. And you can see which of these pieces are useful and not useful as potential tools. I'll also upload some versions of these as a few worksheets into the thing that people can use uh, for, to kind of take a look at their own practice stuff and things like that. Any questions from last week or any comments or anything that you noticed based on kind of what we talked about? What is the wildly open-ended question for? No, we're good. Okay, cool. So let me share screen. One of the other big issues that I've noticed kind of with people is getting them off of the um, like, we're going to just have one intervention for things. So just it's just going to be a learning event, and kind of moving a little bit more into it's a process, not an event kind of thing. Does anybody have stuff that they like? Anybody have ways that they kind of work with people on that, try to get them to understand that it's not just like, hey, we don't just dunk them in a little bit of e-learning or an online webinar and then like the behavior has changed forever. Does anybody have ways that they talk about that or strategies that they use for it?
Julie, I think one thing that's been working for me more recently, and this is more of a recent thing, is just kind of like putting samples together. Like if you're going to do a more of a campaign structure, so to speak, and you're working with like different stakeholders, just having things to say, like, for instance, okay, well, here's what we could do in terms of an intervention, and here's like, guides that we would build, or here's, how we would structure, like we would just kind of, I just feel like showing is better than telling
Yeah.
generally. And we've been trying to really just kind of broaden it with a lot of examples of like, okay, well, here's the documentation we would give for people to, like, let's say we were talking software training, for instance. It's like, okay, here are guides we would give them week 1. Okay, then in week 3 we would do this, this kind of more advanced training, or just kind of laying it out like that. And I feel like that's been working better when they can actually have something tangible to look at, to see. And definitely it's a work in progress still, but I feel just that's been giving me more success on my side, or just opening that conversation more, at least.
Yeah. No, I agree. Because, people, we're often talking to people who don't have a big mental model for this stuff. So being able to show them some concrete examples absolutely makes sense. Anybody else? There's the comment from Michelle. We show sample learning pathways for getting curve, supporting ongoing support for the learning pathway as opposed to a one and done approach. Yep, absolutely. Anybody else have some things that you like that have worked for you as a way to kind of get people to think about this?
I can
Oh,
add
yeah.
on that one. Well, for me, it's I explain them what we know from research, and I talk a lot in terms of ROI, linking it to the research, and usually that resonates. And I'm very happy to see that we are finally changing from this one-time event towards a journey as such. And it's usually also beneficial for them in regards to time, because people don't want to and they cannot afford to spend, let's say, a whole day in a training room anymore. So it's I feel it's like a win-win, and we're moving. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well, although, it's interesting. I'm doing one right now that usually would have been a 2-day workshop, and I'm doing it spread out over 6 weeks. And the interesting part about that has been the challenge of kind of keeping people, like, in some ways it's nice because if you spread it over 6 weeks, you can have callbacks and you can kind of continue to reinforce certain messages over time. But at the same time, like, just people creating that much space in their schedule for 6 whole weeks is turns out really hard. So the yeah, so the difficulty of that has been, because I mean, the one thing about the event-based stuff that I haven't totally figured out an answer to is the sort of protection of leaving your normal workspace, going someplace else and being kind of immersed in it, right? And there's good and bad about that. You're taking people out of context, and that's not great for learning, but you are taking people away from like a lot of the demands on their times and things like that. So, um, Heather?
So I can't speak to how well this works because it's something that I implemented at the last place I worked, like right before I left, basically.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
what I tried to do was inspired by Will Tallheimer, creating an intake form for training requests that sort of had a lot of messaging around, like, I guess the different options available. Like, it doesn't just have to be a storyline module, for example, and asking questions about, what are managers and supervisors going to do to support this learning, and just putting suggestions out there like coaching and adding like job aids and doing things with the environment and that sort of thing. So just, yeah, I guess getting those messages across.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
And maybe like a protected time, like actually what you were just saying, Julie, when it's something extended, maybe it is something like, as a manager, I will support my employees in setting aside this chunk of time every week to be dedicated to this kind of ongoing learning.
Yeah. Because I mean, like people often have good intentions about these things. How many people signed up, especially during like lockdown and stuff, how many people signed up for like an online conference that you were like, oh, I couldn't manage the time to go to this in person, but I'm super stoked it's online, and then like didn't make it to very many sessions? Anybody have that experience, or is it just me? Yeah. Okay. I'm getting a couple nods. Yeah, because that was like, even when I want to, like, even when I want to participate, even when I have good intentions about it, life just has a tendency to continue to show up, even on days where you were like, no, I was going to go and be in sessions and do the thing. So, yeah. So, comment from Mark about having similar challenges when we spread it out. Participants inevitably run into personal and professional hurdles. The longer it goes, the more. We see this I've been doing these workshops for a company, and we've been seeing this sort of gradual decline over the period of time, just because I think people just get busy. Yeah, good from Claire. Good buy-in for nuggets and delayed Lola inspired activities. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways to get to this one. Oh, and Heather's comment about if you don't show up when it's live, the chances of watching the recording are very very low, even when yeah, same here, right? Like, I've saved out the links for at least 4 or 5 of these events where I'm like, I'm going to go watch some of these sessions, and so it's the intention is there, and the execution is not perfect. So anyway, so this one, we've already talked about this a little bit, but can you remind me about some of the topics that you're creating training for? Just drop it in the chat. That's great. It's just a learning objective you might be working on, or a topic that you're creating training for. I know I got some of these last week, but I will admit it's been a oh, I love that. I love that analogy, Mark. Watching the recording is like watching a party through the window. Oh, cool. Okay. Passing technical certifications from Jen. Any other topics that people are creating training for? If you can just drop it in. I just want to have a few so that I can kind of talk to you while we go through it. Local governments programming, that's okay. Innovation practices, methodologies. Ooh, interesting. Executing staff operations to support military operations. I kept reading the first two words of that as executing staff, and that sounded very bad. Andrew. Organizational, Git and GitHub, project management, countering corruption. Ooh, God, that one's not complicated at all, is it, Mark? Advanced robot programming for 3D analysis, digitalization strategies. Okay, fantastic. These are great. All right, so yeah, it's just helpful for me to have a few of those to play with as we go forward. Effective leader performance one-on-ones that improve performance and are consistent with company values. Ooh, okay, great. Identifying, marking, controlling, and disposing of classified matter. That's not topical at all there, Michelle. So, okay. So this is the tool that I use to try to help people kind of wrap their heads around this mindset. And it's this, I've been referring to it as a learning experience map, but I don't know if I've 100% settled on that title. But it's this idea of like thinking about kind of a little bit more learning as a process. And I'll go through each of these categories. But it's the idea is there's something that we want them to do to prepare. What does the learning event or events look like? How are they going to practice? How do they do feedback coaching and mentoring? What do we do around job aid resources or just-in-time support? How do we refresh stuff? And then how do they delve further if that's something that they're ultimately interested in? Kind of what's the plan for that? So like I said, I'll talk about each of these. So preparation, it could be any of those things. It could be pre-assessment, it could be some kind of pre-learning, it could be a priming, it could be a learning campaign like, hey, we just want to get you excited about this, right? We're going to do a top 10, a Letterman style top 10 list. I don't know how out of date that reference is anymore. I think there's a lot of people who no longer know what those are, but you know, what's the thing that happens beforehand, if anything? Is it just, hey, we want you to gather up some resources to bring to class or to a workshop or to a learning experience? Do we want you to identify examples? Do we want you to read an article? You know, any of this kind of stuff. You know, as we all know, there's challenges with pre-work, right? The big one is the pre-work. Oh gosh, I wouldn't call it a pre-work conundrum, the pre-work dilemma. I guess dilemma is a good word, which is you can't count on anybody to do it. And so therefore you can't actually make use of it when you get to the class because you can't assume that everybody's done it. And so you either do the thing where you, if you do assume that people have done it, you're going to have to still figure out how do you catch up to people who didn't do it. If you assume that nobody's done it and therefore you don't make use of it, you're sort of punishing the people who actually did it by not acknowledging or making use of the pre-work that they did. So either you leave behind the people who didn't do it, or you punish the people who did do it by repeating everything all over again. Because so I don't know if anybody's had good experiences. Um, uh, you were the one who prepared to explain to the non-prepared ones. Yeah. Yeah. No, there's definitely like strategies around it. Does anybody else have like, I mean, you can make it a required thing. Like they can't, you know, they can't sign up for the class until they've completed the pre-work or things like that. Which is, I think, kind of where Mark's going with that one. The LMS can restrict registration for instructor training until they completed. Yeah, that doesn't mean they paid attention until they click through the e-learning. Something that's very kind of like forced on them, people will find ways to find ways around it, unfortunately. So like if we required e-learning, hopefully it's an effective strategy, but and oh yeah, punishment of the prepared in the evaluation. Yeah, so this is, you know, this is an ongoing challenge. And I don't have a great answer to it other than to have you know, the only thing that I usually do with this is to have pre-work be a beneficial but not required element for stuff. Obviously, yeah, you can get into we can force people to do it, or we can, you know, do these kinds of things. So those are challenges, right? Like the yeah, I agree, Deb. The no win situation often describes this one. Um, you know, the challenge of it. So I still use it sometimes, but I tend to have a bit of a light touch with it, which isn't necessarily the greatest answer. there are definitely environments where it is uh, I like what Rich just said, to find a way to elevate the status of the prepared, make them heroes. Yeah, somehow make it, a rewarding thing to do it rather than a punitive thing if you don't. Or even worse, a punitive thing if you did. So these are all, these are all options. But yeah, I do tend to lean into a light touch on this stuff now. The learning experiences, I'll show you some of the resources that I have on this a little bit later, but this is kind of our big piece of it, right? What are the learning activities? What kinds of experiences do we want people to have? What do we want them to do as part of the quote unquote learning experience? And it could be a single learning experience. It could be spread out over time. It could be something that we come back to. Like, it's not necessarily just one event, but I mean, we're introducing new content, we're introducing new material, new skills, something like that is usually what I think of as being this. Then practice is, apparently I prepared this deck for a group that was training vaccination workers. So sorry about I don't know if this is everybody's favorite image, but when I put these together, that was the target audience that I was dealing with. So, but practice is the question of where are they going to practice, especially if we've identified it as a skill. So last week we talked about the fact that my kind of working definition is it reasonable to think somebody can be proficient without practice? And if the answer is no, they really do need to practice and to be good at it, then that's what I usually put in kind of my skill bucket and run through the models that I have for skill stuff. And I'll share those if we've got time today. Otherwise, maybe next week I'll show you kind of how do I break down skills a little bit too. But if it's a skill, we have to design practice. That's the implication of that statement. And so then the question is, does the practice happen during the learning environment? Does it happen after the learning environment? And often, how are we giving people a visceral experience of the thing that we're asking them to do? And the answer isn't either or, during or after. It should be both, probably. They should probably practice during the learning environment, but then there also should be some mechanism for practice after they leave the learning environment, so that, especially if it's a complex skill where they're going to need more than one or two go rounds with it. Then feedback, coaching, mentoring. The nice thing about having this be part of this kind of whole learning process is it just creates a little space when I'm talking to stakeholders and stuff about, okay, how is this going to happen, right? Because I think one of the biggest sort of wasted resources is, hey, we crafted a really great learning experience, but then there was no follow through after the fact. Anybody familiar with Emma Weber's stuff? She's out of Australia. She sometimes does LDA stuff. I don't think she's presenting in this, but she does learning transfer. And so it's specifically people, yeah, she's doing, it's called Coach M, I think is what she's calling it. And so, I mean, what she has historically done is have provided a service where they just literally come in and they're the sort of coaching, facilitation, and scaffolding after the fact. So if you go through leadership training, how are we going to do this? And one of the interesting things she's done recently is this Coach M chatbot, which is they took all of the coaching conversations that they had had over the years and basically analyzed what the paths were. And it was actually fairly predictable how those conversations would go. And they would create a chatbot for it, which I love the idea of. But I was asking her about this. I was in Australia in September, and I was asking her about, like, well, what happens if, like, the novelty wears off or they start ignoring the chatbot? And she's like, oh, we follow up. Like, a person will reach out and say, hey, I noticed you didn't respond to the last two. Is there anything I can do to help you? And I'm like, okay, that's great, because we know that, like, good intentions are fantastic, but who's actually paying attention to if I do this, or if I, who's actually even just knowing that somebody's there and they care about whether this is working for you. I think that makes a big, huge difference in the follow-up. So it becomes this question of what kind of feedback mechanisms or what kind of coaching or what kind of follow-up is going to happen afterwards. Assistive supervision is specifically a term that shows up more in those healthcare environments. Like I said, this was a deck that I put together for that. But even like self-assessment or some kind of peer assessment, but some some mechanism that follows you back into the real world and continues to support this. Because especially with skills-based stuff, one of the big challenges is you can practice and practice and practice, which it would be great if you did that. But there also needs to be, especially in more complex skills, there needs to be some kind of feedback mechanism to say, okay, you're practicing this thing over and over again, but is it right? So um, has anybody like got some good mechanisms in place in your organizations, or seen this in some places where you feel like there was really good support around the sort of follow-up coaching, mentoring, those kinds of things? Yeah. So if you like that, the buddy system, keep each other accountable. I think that makes complete sense. And at least, it may not be a perfect answer, but it at least increases the likelihood that there'll be some follow-up kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, what Clark's saying about a team that wouldn't release learning until they provided management supervisor training. I do think that that is anything where it's skills based. We probably should be treating management as part of our audience. So how do we support the learners to go out into the world, but also how do we support management with skills and tools and things like that to be the feedback mechanism that's necessary? And I will tell you, I don't always get that. Like that's not to not extinguish the learning. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I don't always get that, but I certainly always ask, see if there's a way to like considers management supervisors to be part of the audience that need training tool support, those kinds of things. For Michelle, we use a lot of the on-the-job training, but I see it's very dependent on the coach mentor as to whether it's effective. Yeah, it is harder to control for it, right? I was working with a group that had um, they were training project managers, and it was a company that did electrical installation. So if somebody's building an office building, this company would come in and run all the electrical throughout the building, like so large scale projects. And they would do smaller stuff too. They might do houses or smaller buildings, but they'd also do these large buildings. And so this was the company that had all of this. And so project management was a very complex task in that organization. And so when they'd start to kind of grow project managers, we'd have some upfront e-learning as a pre-learning activity before they would go into class, and they would work through like 2 different project management budgets from start to finish. So putting into the system, what do they need to consider, all those kinds of things. But then when they came out of it, they had a tiered system. So until they the first tier was a budget of no more than $10,000 for a project. So they would create budgets, they would do project management for these $10,000 or under, and somebody would always check everything that they were doing and give them feedback. And then at a certain point, they could graduate out of that tier, and they could go up to, I don't know, it's 25 or 50,000. I don't remember the exact amounts, but they could go bump up a tier, and then it was a lighter view in terms of the management and supervising. They'd still get stuff we looked at, but it wasn't like everything they were doing was getting checked. And then eventually they graduate to kind of the third tier, which was sort of fully out there in the world. And so having like an actual stepped plan for what kind of supervision does this person need right out of the gate? What kind of feedback do they need right out of the gate? And then how do they move up tiers as they do it? We've got open communication line with the experts on technical training. Yeah, no, that makes sense from Claire. And e-learning for a healthcare organization board members, and a PDF guide for board chairs that they can follow along and check with new board members to hopefully reinforce their learning as they go through. Yeah, no, there's a lot of different ways we can slice and dice this, but it is probably, especially with anything that's complex, probably one of the most important aspects of it is how do we not just sort of push them out of the nest and hope they fly? Because a lot of times they don't, and that's messy. So, okay. Resources are just in time support. This is just your performance support stuff, right? Like, is it just in time learning? Is it performance support? Is it references? Is it updates? Is it like, it's just whatever kind of support material we need to have out there in the world. And then the refresh one, so the two biggest instances where I really kind of lean into a refresh, one is infrequently used material. So this is going to be anything where, maybe they're only going to see it twice a year or, something like that. And so then I will talk to people about like, okay, what's our refresh interval? Because we can't expect people to remember everything through the training if they don't see this again for 8 months. So do we need to have a 6-month refresh interval, or what do we need? And some people mentioned Will Tallheimer stuff, like his spacing stuff and things like that can be a good way to think about refresh. The T+2+2 is something that Art Cohn does. Has anybody seen his stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll put his name in the chat. And there's an article which I will try to remember to pull and stick in the resources that he did for the Learning Guild, where he does this 2+2+2, which is 2 days after he'll ask like a knowledge-based question from the course, 2 weeks after he'll ask more of an application question, and 2 months after he'll do another one that's, I think, more of like, how are you applying or something like that. And that interval is a nice one from a spacing point of view, so that there can be these touch points, because part of it is like we can't expect people to remember stuff. Part of it is just the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve spacing thing, where we're, by pulling it back into active memory, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, we're increasing the likelihood that we retain it long term over time. Anybody using anything for those kinds of refresh scenarios? Art Booster Learn platform. Yeah, Mark, did it seem to work pretty well?
It did work, I thought, very well. I ended up over the course of 3 or 4 years sending out about 90,000 emails with multiple choice or fill in the blank type questions, and some were open-ended. And I think I had a 42 or 43% response rate. Not just open rate response, people actually clicking on an answer or providing a response. And this is ArtCon's model, so as it went on, the questions were meant to get a little more difficult, and also a little bit more about what have you done with what you've learned in the workplace, and if nothing else, hopefully prompting them that they should be doing something, even if they have nothing to report back. But we got really, really great data on the learning points that people weren't picking up on. So we were able to go back to the trainers and say, hey, a lot of people are getting this one wrong. Are we sure we're covering this in the training correctly? But then also reinforcing learning and prompting action in the workplace. I love that program. It was really good.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Message to the future. Yeah, no, I love those too. I've seen some different models of that one, where they can kind of send their own follow-up and stuff like that. But no, I'm excited. I'm happy to learn that. And yeah, 42% response rate is phenomenal. We know how busy everybody gets. That's a really good rate, actually. So okay. So yeah, so part of it is that, like, I think art stuff focuses very much on how do I get this well seated in your memory so that you hang on to it over a long period of time. And then there's also an element of how do I bring this back to mind? There's also stuff where you see a fall off. And so then the question, like, you might see good, so like, let's say we're doing cybersecurity and we teach people how to create strong passwords, right? What often will happen with something like that, and I don't have data on this, so this is anecdata, but I'll do it anyway, where you get kind of people who are using it pretty strongly for a few weeks outside of the course, but then there's a gradual erosion over time of the diligence of that practice, right? So that's another kind of candidate for a refresher thing. If this is something where the behavior requires people to be somewhat diligent over time, with this, you don't want to just do the single intervention and never like touch back with them. You want to be able to kind of check back in over time and have it be something where occasionally you have some interesting way to refresh that, or kind of reinvigorate the practice, I guess is as close a term. Okay, so you're using Google Docs instead of the Booster Learn. It's clunkier, but better than nothing. Yeah, no, that's great. Forums for users. Yeah, I don't have a ton of stuff in terms of like the community or social involvement after this, although actually maybe that's a good thing to think about. But one of the issues with any kind of community-based forum discussion, whatever, is that those really need to be seated well, and then they need to be tended. And part of part of that is we sometimes treat the social learning tools as machines and we turn them on and expect them to kind of run. But really, gardens is a better analogy for community-based or social platforms where it needs to be kind of tended and cultivated and needs a lot of attention until it's well established and some of those kinds of things. Um, if people are interested in the social learning piece, um, the book I always recommend is Community Building for the Web, which is Amy Jo Kim. Um, I think my title's probably slightly off, but you'd totally find it. She wrote it, I don't know, maybe like 20 years old now or something, but she's really brilliant around the social learning piece and social interaction. She comes from like a game design background and some of these kinds of things. And is just generally a brilliant person about a lot of stuff, but she did some of the early community design around being a seller in like eBay and some of those kinds of places, which is what are some of the elements and some of the different roles, active roles you need for good community development. So if that topic is of interest, I highly recommend that resource. Okay. So refresh can be about memory. It can be about kind of continuing to kind of invigorate or support the behavior. It can be about kind of deepening people's understanding. And it also can be, as Mark pointed out, a really nice source of data to feed back in because you're actually getting some indicators about what's sticking and what's not sticking with people and things like that. Okay, and then just the sort of question of developing further. What are there opportunities to improve or master skills? What options do they have to learn advanced topics? One of the things that we're seeing kind of over and over again is I was just doing this yesterday with this lovely person who is trying to teach navigation, like boats, like how do you navigate boats and how do you like use coordinates and all of these kinds of things. And he was doing this huge thing where he's like, you divide the globe up into 360 and it's really a bunch of equilateral triangles and da 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 da. And I was like, oh, hang on here. First of all, it was an enormous amount of cognitive load. And second of all, like, I understand why this is a logical way for you as an expert to explain what this stuff is. But we probably need something that's a little bit more practical to ease people into it. And he's like, oh, so we could like start by playing Battleship. And I'm like, yes, that would be awesome. Right. I love that idea. And so one of the big issues that we always see is, if it's a complex topic, if it's got a lot going on, we need to not assume we're going to get people to really high level of mastery, right out of the gate. And so I found it useful to put a place for that level 2 knowledge, like, okay, you want to tell them everything. I get that. That's great. But if this is a realistic introduction so that people can start to have a little bit of a mental model in their head, how are we going to come back later? So an example of using this is I was working with a big manufacturing company doing an audit of their Six Sigma programs. And their classroom stuff is actually not pretty good. Like, there's always things you can tweak about it, but their classroom stuff was pretty good. They had problems with the pre-learning piece because really what they needed is for people to do some stats and to do some other kinds of like make sure they had their head wrapped around certain concepts before they came into the black belt courses. But then the other thing that we identified as part of the audit was that the 6-month mark was a really actually nice insertion point for some refresh further knowledge stuff. Because they would typically, their first project would typically take about 6 months. And so they would have had their big intensive course up here. They'd be going through a project with pretty good mentoring supervision for the first 6 months. And so we actually had this really nice point at the 6-month mark where we could come back and now some of the stuff that we taught you in that first class, we could refresh that because you haven't heard it in 6 months and you haven't started a project in 6 months, but then also like you now have a project under your belt. And so now a lot of the stuff that we really are hoping to kind of, dig into a little bit more deeply, you've got some context for it now. And so it's much easier to understand some of the more sophisticated parts of this, or some of the more complexity, some of the additional complexity for it. And so being able to kind of sometimes do that, which is, hey, this is the intro level, and then we're going to deliberately set a time frame for when we come back and do, okay, here's the level 2 material, or here's the refresh, or here's the thing. Is anybody using anything like that now, where you've got that deliberate, like, here's our intro, and then we've got a point where we come back and we kind of do next level stuff? Okay. All right. No, but like the idea. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because it's sometimes, if you can plan for it, it's amazing what kind of works in this. My very first training professional job, I was training data entry clerks to process loan applications. And it was for the company, it was for a company that's did loan applications for mobile homes, right? So I used to know an awful lot about different models of mobile homes, and single wides and double wides, and the different manufacturers and all this kind of stuff. Way back in the day, this is like 30 years ago now. Uh, certain kinds of, so generally speaking, 90% of the applications that they would do would just be a mobile home application, which is closer to like a loan application for like a vehicle or something in terms of its complexity. But every once in a while, we'd have an application that comes with the home, but also the plot of land that they're going to do it on. And there would be the loan for both of those. And as soon as you add land in, you have all of the real estate law and all of the real estate governance that shows up. And so what would be this complex of a loan application would suddenly become this complex of a loan application. And so what we found is that, like, it just wasn't productive to try to teach people how to do these loan applications as beginners, because they just hadn't the context, they didn't understand things, it was too much, they were overwhelmed, all this kind of stuff. So we basically just said, hey, if you get one of these, because the process would, you just go grab a pile, like the next 5 off the stack, and go enter them, because this was the days of fax machines. So it was still all faxed in, and they had to do data entry. If you get a landed home, you ask your experienced mentor person, whoever that is, or the manager will give you one or whatever, and they will sit next to you and help you do this. And you are not responsible for trying to understand how to do this on your own. But then after they'd been there like 2 months, it was usually about 8 weeks, 6 or 8 weeks later, we would bring them back in, and we would actually go, all right, here's all of the stuff you need to do. We'd actually do the formal training on how to do this. So they would have had the context of how do I enter loan applications at all is now very familiar to them. And they would have been through the experience of going through these land and home thing, or the ones with land on them. Even though they didn't necessarily understand everything that they were doing while they were doing that, they had at least seen all the forms and all the fields and things like that, so that we could come back at the 6 or 8 week mark and do the full course on it. And they'd be like, oh, this makes so much more sense. I didn't really understand why I was doing what I was doing. Thank you for enlightening me. Instead of, so they were actually happy to have the information at that point, rather than if we had tried to include it in the beginning curriculum, when they would have just been totally overwhelmed. So that's kind of what we're going for here, which is, what's level 1 adequately, and is there a level 2, and how do we follow up with that? And if there isn't a level 2, if it's more like, hey, I really love this project management thing, I want to dig more into it, then can I provide opportunities for you to go look at PMP certification, or to take some advanced courses somewhere, or something like that? So it didn't have to be like a formal second step, but it would be like, if you want to learn more about this, here's where you go, or here's some resources for it, or things like that. Okay. I'm just trying to catch up with the chat. Where the courses and labs get more advanced as the learners go, from Jen. Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And it doesn't have to be like a big gap. I mean, it can actually be a stair step through these things. Hands-on workshops that follow general training for cohorts that are actively using new tools. But that's very ad hoc. Yeah, I've seen that too. We've done the thing where you have the whole e-learning on how to use the computer system, and then have a lab environment a week or two later where they can go practice entering stuff and see if they have questions and try it hands-on, and some of those kinds of things. That can be another way to do the develop further. Um, uh, basic short intro, then full e-learning, then virtual Q&A, and if you need more advanced content, customized hands-on training in person. Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously there's no one right answer for how this should play out, but I find that if I have a box in here, then we're having that conversation a little bit more deliberately. So this framework becomes the thing that I'm using to kind of like talk through all of these. I don't use all of these on every project, right? The answer is it depends. But I talk, we kind of consider each of these categories, and do we feel like we need something in them? So, as I mentioned, preparation would be like pre-work, awareness campaigns, could be a case study that they take a look at. It could be prepping some of their materials to bring to class, things like that. The learning is just whatever the learning activity is, classroom, e-learning, self-study, different kinds of things. Practice is often like that's where the role plays show up. It could be the hands-on practice. It could be paired practice activities. If it's in class, it could be specific challenges that they need to, things they need to do when they go back to the real world that then we maybe have managers follow up on, or things like that. Feedback, coaching, mentoring, so coaching checklists, coaching checklist evaluation, self or peer evaluation, just whatever the mechanism. How are they going to get feedback on stuff? Um, uh, and then obviously job aid stuff. You guys all know what that looks like. The refresh could be refresher training. It could be follow-up questions. It could be here are some activities for your team meetings over the next like 3 quarters or something to follow up and reinforce the training. Like you can even just have a conversation about it. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And then obviously the developing further, we just talked about that one, but that's the additional learning opportunities. It could be community-based stuff. It could be any of those kinds of things. Um, yeah, the learning event very early in the process. Yeah, helping people kind of understand the whole continuum of it rather than being really focused on that second column is the only thing that's going to happen. And by the way, one of the challenges that I have with the representation of this, and if anybody has any ideas, I'll totally take thoughts on this. One of the things with this is the challenges is this isn't necessarily a linear process either. This could iterate in places or circle and kind of come back and go forward and things like that. And so that's been one of the other challenges that I've had with this one is people want to do it boom, 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 because it goes from left to right, which is a useful format for being able to fill things in, but not necessarily. I don't like the implication that this always has to go from left to right as the processes go. But I haven't found a good way around it that isn't confusing. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I'll totally take it. Okay, so certain types of gaps from last week, we talked about certain types of gaps lean into certain columns here, right? So a knowledge-based thing could be learning, it could be job aids, it could be some kind of refresh, right? Like how to do complex passwords. I'm going to teach you how to do it. I'm not going to make you practice it 9 million times because it's not that hard, but I will make sure you have a resource that you can use when you do complex passwords, and I will refresh it periodically, that kind of thing. So those columns I might lean into for a knowledge-based activity. For procedural stuff, and so procedure, just a reminder, is anything where we have really well-defined performance. Do this, do this, do this. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So like software, a lot of medical stuff is proceduralized. Safety things can be proceduralized, whatever they are. And again, that one's probably learning practice until they get comfortable with it, and then maybe job aids, performance support. I might also have a refresh on that one. Just depends on if it's something they're going to use every day, you probably don't need a big refresh. You probably just need some way to validate that they're doing it right. Yeah, I think it could be a roadmap image or something. I'm still puzzling that one out. Skills, Actually, I'll tell you, if it's a complex skill, I think it's all of these. But it might be, but the really crucial part is to get people to understand the importance of that third and fourth column, the practice and the feedback, coaching, mentoring around skills. Often these are things where there is that kind of level one skill that I want people to get to, but then we want, once people have some mastery of that, we want them to move them up. I would say there's no reason not to use job aids or refresh for skills, but this tends to be a little bit of my emphasis for it, just because again, I'm trying to communicate to stakeholders or to the people I'm working with the real importance of that third, fourth column here. Habits, it's kind of all of the above. If it's a habit-based thing, there should probably be some practice. There should be some kind of feedback mechanism. It might not be a supervisor or something. It might be your own like little tracker that you're just following, but just seeing how you're doing with a habit. Resources or just-in-time support are often a big piece of this, and then some kind of refresh method is often a useful thing when we're talking about habit formation. Motivation, I do think, leans into these first ones. Again, none of these columns are out of bounds for this. This map is just where I tend to put my emphasis a little bit. Really the preparation, so starting to think about things, learning. They know what to do, but they're still not doing it. And so how do we kind of create that? A lot of times getting people to practice and be really comfortable with the new behavior is a big part of the motivation stuff. I think next week I'll have time to kind of just run through the checklist I have for motivation issues, and then that maps across to different learning activities too. But I'll spend some time on that. And then, like, if it's an environment thing, where really it's about fixing the system or fixing the environment, usually the main strategy we have in that space is the resource that we can kind of put next to them while they're working. Whether it's a job aid, whether it's some kind of prompts, whether it's some shaping of what resources are available to them in the environment. Those kinds of things tend to be, depending on what I would define as the gap, these tend to be some areas of emphasis. Does this make sense? Any questions about it? Anything you would sort of like, I think you should do it a little bit differently, or I would do it a little bit differently? Anybody need examples of something? Just Googled visualizing iterative processes and found a bunch of bad examples. Yeah, see, this is the thing, right, Mark? I don't know exactly where, like, I want to give people the idea that it's not this big straight line, but at the same time, I'm very concerned about like overwhelming people the minute I don't present it in a more straightforward way. So yeah, you're seeing my balance point on this one, I think. All right. Okay. Um, yeah, I think you're right, Deb. I think there is a timing question to it. And I've been playing around with, I don't know if I have it in this one, but I have it in the other decks. Let me grab it real quick. I've been playing around with some different formats for this. Um, I'll show you a thing that I did. And this was just a hypothetical, so this isn't the final version of stuff, but was looking at the timing piece. So let me reshare the screen. Hang on. Stop share. I was using a different mechanism here, which is the idea of like fast little knowledge nuggets, slower things, which are skills that take more time to develop, and then really slow, which is the sort of meta skill of hazard problem prevention, problem solving. So this is like the idea of like, these are different time intervals around really growing your skills around safety in different, in this case, a manufacturing plant. And so looking at something like this, where we were looking at really this emphasis on little knowledge nuggets for the fast skills to have a refresh, and then continually kind of trying to iterate people's the medium skills, which might be more like as I said, fast might be hazard recognition. Is this bad or is this good or bad? I just need you to know. Safety procedure knowledge could also be fast, but habits around safety would be a little bit more medium. And then your big meta sort of problem solving around this is a slow scale. And so trying to think of like, how do we structure a curriculum around this? And like, this was one that we were looking at, which was getting into the like little practice of like hazard recognition, practice of, you know, different things, some slower things that we would develop over time, like maybe goal setting and ownership, negotiating, communication, troubleshooting, having the why show up periodically, so as a motivation reinforcement, and then having some core skills, but then a follow up with some, you know, things. So trying to figure out how do we spread this out over time. And this was like I said, this was conceptual for this client. The real versions were much more complicated, but just showing them that we wanted to kind of think through a whole curriculum over time and not just be like, hey, we're going to have 2-day workshops up front, you know. But the visualizations on that I highly imperfect. So all right, let me jump back to this other one. All right. We have got a few more minutes. So yeah, so sometimes it's just a matter of like explaining that it's not usually like all these straight through. It might be this and this, or it could be, you know, something like this. So, you know, just kind of explaining like, look, the path is not a straight line and you don't go through all of these necessarily, but we kind of consider all of them. So like learners must be able to properly store vaccines and safe injection equipment. Like I said, I prepped this deck for people training vaccination workers. And so that one might just be, you know, learning, some practice, and then job aids resources. And, you know, we do want to make sure that it's happening right. So whether that happens as a refresh kind of thing or a coaching mentoring thing. Um, Learners must create an activity timeline and natural monitoring and evaluation framework. This is a kind of bigger picture skill that they were having to do. And so I would say that we would be more likely to have that be kind of spread out across this whole map. And we want to be looking at kind of every category for some of those. And then so the, you know, being able to kind of have this conversation and figure out where would we put certain things. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I guess the question is are there any questions about this, or does anybody have examples of stuff that they you know feel like has worked well for some of these? And oh no, I'm sorry, we've got another half hour. My bad. I am just or no, when are we? Do we have another half hour? I'm sorry. I'm just kind of like being full disclosure to everybody that apparently last week I thought we had longer time, and today I think we have shorter time. That's all good. I will get into some of the skill stuff since we have a half an hour left. But before we get into it, I don't know, what are any questions about this or any comments or anything that you've seen do stuff with this well? Yeah, but the third session I'll get the timing right. My bad. I've had like 9 workshop webinars this week, so I'm actually not that surprised. I'm losing track of things. No. All right. Okay. So yeah, like I said, this is just a tool. I'll make sure that the worksheet for this is up on is loaded up. Esther and I can kind of follow up on that after the fact.
Actually, Julie, I do have a question.
Sure.
You know, the examples that you just put up, you had like basically one learning objective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you've got, you know, if this is like a full-on program with like, I don't know, 20 plus learning objectives, do you kind of think through each of them this way or try to put them into buckets? Or
Yeah. No, the challenge with that is there, like you actually put your finger on a particular point that's a little bit of a challenge, right? I find it's useful to go through it at the learning objective level. However, I don't know if I would go through it for every single learning objective. And the truth is we all know that not all our learning objectives are created equally, right? So like there are ones that are more crucial than others. So typically what I lean into is doing this for the ones that are the really crucial behaviors. However, if I'm doing a prep activity, I'm not, and I've identified prep as like a good thing for 3 different learning objectives, I'm still probably only going to do one preparation activity, and then I'm going to prioritize between those, right? So can my preparation activity encompass the 3 different places where I've identified preparation as a useful activity, or do I just focus on one because I'm not going to get somebody to do 3 different preparation activities? So there is this sort of like going down to the learning objective level is actually helpful for thinking these things out, because you really do need to, probably for each learning objective, you do need to think about things like practice or feedback, or what's the or performance support for each one of those. But then I'm still going to kind of roll this back up to more of the lesson or curriculum level, and look at how they fit together. So I would love to have a really concrete, simple answer to that, but the answer is you kind of like look at them individually, but then wish them together, if that's not too wishy-washy an answer. All right. Okay. So let me just take a quick look and see what I think is most useful to use for the last bit of this. Hang on. All right, I will ask you guys. Here's the 2 choices for how I can use this last half hour. We might as well let you have your own opinions about this. I can kind of do a quick survey of the categories, so the knowledge, procedure, skills, so forth, and just kind of the basic learning strategies behind it. I kind of feel like that one's probably stuff you already know, or I can do like a breakdown of some of the stuff that I usually look at when I have another level that I go down on skills to start breaking them across. So I can spend the last half hour kind of just showing you some of the skills framework stuff. So go ahead and vote in the chat. I would either like gaps, which is all of the gaps, which is a top level thing, or skills, which is the next level breakdown. Okay. Yeah, I kind of sold that one too. I think the top level view you guys have a pretty good handle on, so this is probably better. So I'm just going to open up a different deck. One sec. Okay. Come on. There it goes. Okay. If you got a full screen, do people see it? You see some skills obsession here? Oh, just a little bit. It's interesting because I'm seeing all the stuff talking about skills, and I would say that most of these conversations about skills are not the conversations I'm having about skills. So I'm waiting for somebody, somebody who's talking about it in a similar way. Miriam Nealon is doing some good stuff on complex skills, although her formula comes out of like the 10 steps for complex skills development, which is the Yaron and Marion Bauer and Kirshner. Is that the Clark will know.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. It was Paul and Marion Bauer's the 10 steps for complex skills book, right? I think. I don't know. I'm losing track of my who wrote what, but yeah, some of those. So but what they mean by complex skills is what I think is actually sort of complicated, or things that have a lot of parts. And so this is a little bit of a different set of definitions when they were talking about complex skills here. So I am going to show you kind of how. One of the things that I struggled with when I was originally creating that GAPS model was that skills didn't feel like it was a little bit too big a bucket. Like there had to be some sort of ways to think about different characteristics of skills so that you could start to kind of map those across to learning strategies and things like that. Which, same problem, right? Like do I put it in the skills bucket at all? Is it reasonable to think that somebody can be proficient without practice? No, it's not reasonable. It's a skill. Also, if it involves judgment or decision making or variability of answers, are some of the other things that clearly put something over in the skills bucket for me. We already did this last time, the skill, not a skill. So saving a file in Microsoft Word would not be a skill because that's pretty procedural, like step, step, step. Yeah, there's a little bit of variability. There's a few different ways to do it, but it isn't really it's not complex. There isn't decision making. People don't really need to practice that. They can just follow the steps, that kind of thing. But playing volleyball or giving a performance review, clearly, yes, a skill, because complex variability, decision making, people need to practice to get good at it, all that kind of stuff. So one of the things with this is sensitivity to context. So if I'm going to take this skill and I'm going to use it, so let's say my skill is giving feedback to my employees. That's a complex skill, I would argue. So if my skill is giving feedback to complex employees, there's a metaphor that Chris Dede uses that I kind of like, where he talks about how some things are problems, sleeping problems, and some things are eating problems, and some things are bonding problems. And I'll explain what each one of these are. So a sleeping problem is, no matter what part of the world you're in, no matter what your context in, sleeping is probably, you can solve a sleeping problem with warm, safe, dark, quiet, comfortable, right? And as long as you have those 5 characteristics, warm, safe, dark, quiet, comfortable, it's probably going to be an okay answer to a sleeping problem. So if you grew up in a traditional household in Japan, maybe you're a little bit more used to tatami mats than you are to like hammocks than you are to like, bed, like this kind of bed, or, whatever your framework is. But honestly, if you accidentally, not accidentally, if you gave somebody a different format of sleeping space, but it was warm, safe, dark, quiet, and comfortable, it's probably still going to solve the problem. So you can't, the nice thing about sleeping problems is they're fairly simple. You kind of can't get them wrong that easily, as long as you've got your kind of core elements to it. Now, an eating problem, what the right answer is to an eating problem is going to depend a little bit more on what's the situation. So is it breakfast, lunch, or dinner? Is it good, like you're going to have a different solution to your eating problem depending on if it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So like something that takes 45 minutes to serve and is very elaborate might be an appropriate answer to dinner, but it's going to mess people up if it's breakfast and they really need to get something quick and kind of keep moving. Also, if it's a social situation, if it's, what do you eat on a date? What do you eat if you're at a work meeting? What do you eat? Like these answers are going to change. What do you do if it's a wedding or if it's a holiday or, whatever? Like a Thanksgiving answer that doesn't include like the cranberry relish and the sweet potatoes is kind of unsatisfying to me, and I'm not very happy with it, right? Whatever your things are, there's going to be more variability. However, fundamentally, like as long as it's nutritious and, quells the hunger, it's probably okay, but you're still going to need more variability in terms of the answer that you come up with. And then a bonding problem, what's an appropriate answer in one context could be a wildly inappropriate answer in another context. So you bond with all sorts of people. You bond with coworkers, you bond with romantic partners, you bond with, your friends' kids, you bond with colleagues, you bond with people that you do, social activities with, friends, you bond with, all of these different, like there's many, many different kinds of people that you bond with. And one of the problems we have in, like, say, sexual harassment training is a bonding technique that's appropriate for a romantic partner and or in, a casual friend situation is not appropriate necessarily in a work environment. And if you move the answer from one context to another context, it can actually be harmful and or inappropriate and or, totally fail to solve the problem or things like that. And so the issue with this is simple problems or sleeping problems, as long as you've got the key characteristics, it's going to be fine. Eating problems, some answers are better than others. It just depends. And bonding problems, what is appropriate in one circumstance could be wildly inappropriate and potentially damaging in another context. So if if I said the skill of giving feedback to an employee, where would you rate this on this continuum? Sleeping to eating to bonding. Where would you expect that giving feedback would sit in this continuum. Okay, got to vote for bonding, eating or bonding. Yeah, I think that's a bonding for sure. Yeah, I think it's somewhere in there, right? Like, and some of it depends a little bit, but you could have a method of motivating that's really great for this one employee over here, and it would be totally demotivating. Like, I'm going to set you some really hard challenges. You would like totally freak out and, kind of mess things up for your less secure employee over here and things like that. So I think eating to bonding is probably a good assessment for that. So, what's the challenge then from a learning point of view if we're not dealing, because think that we want everything to be sleeping problems and not everything is a sleeping problem. So what's the challenge when we have to start creating learning environments for things like bonding problems? I like that answer, Rich. Bonding over a meal. What's the difficulty with like creating learning environments for this kind of stuff? It's more over on this right-hand side, more into eating and yeah, creating a sufficient number of examples to develop skill. Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% one of the big things I'm trying to consider. Like, how many examples do you need to see before you can start to do that? Large number of circumstances, audiences. Yeah, you have real variety too, right? And you're starting to get into things like what's people's style for this stuff and, things like that. People want the answer and there isn't one. Uh-huh. Absolutely, right? Everything wants to get shoved into this like simple box, and not everything can be. So maybe this is harder than a multiple choice question can encompass sometimes. Okay, so this model, by the way, Chris Tiede formulated this when he was talking about educational technology, which is he was basically trying to talk to, he's at Harvard in the educational psychology, educational technology arena, and he was trying to deal with the fact that like, we'll just get them all iPads. Like that's going to solve educational problems. And there are certain educational problems that are simple to solve. There are sleeping problems. Like how do you give kids lots of practice doing math problems? Might be a simpler problem. But what kind of math intervention does a particular student need is probably more of needing to a bonding problem. And so, you know, technology solutions that abstract out the teacher immediately are kind of not great if a student really needs individual attention versus needing the same answer that thousands of other kids are getting via their iPads or whatever it is. Okay. So, when we talk about complex skills, we really are talking about these things that sit more into kind of the eating bonding realm, which is like being a substance abuse therapist, right? Like the tough love that might work with one client is going to totally freak out another client and drive them away, right? So like there is a high degree of variability. Project management, budgeting, maybe filling out the budget is easy, but actually being able to like pinpoint and anticipate the problems in your budget, that might be much more complex. And then you just have things that have a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces and a lot of things that you can't predict. So like Six Sigma statistical process control or something like that. Anybody know this model? It's Cynefin by Dave Snowden. Anybody familiar with this one? Yep, Mark's hand and waving. Okay. Yeah, this is another way to break down a similar kind of thing, which is this moving from simple to simple, complicated, complex, chaotic. So it goes counterclockwise on this particular version of it. He keeps changing the name of this bottom right corner. I think the current version has it listed as clear and not simple. It was obvious for a while, but I think the current version in his latest book is that he's not calling that one clear. But we'll just use simple for our own purposes right now because that's what I've got in these slides. So this is a model that Dave Snowden created to talk about organizational challenges or organizational problems. And it first came out in a Harvard Business Review article, I think it was like around 2008, something like that. And it's based on some work he did at IBM, but don't quote me on that. I maybe need to go back and read up on my origins. But I found that it was actually really useful because depending on where the skill tends to sit within this model, it starts pointing to me towards certain kinds of learning strategies. So let me get into this. So simple is he's simple, obvious. Like I said, I think he's now using the word clear. It's something where we know the answer, right? How do you take blood pressure? We know the answer to how you take blood pressure. How do you prepare the airplane for, do the safety checks on the airplane before you take off? We know the answers to these things. These are well spelled out, well defined. We know exactly what correct performance looks like. They're the well-defined problems. It's what I was referring to as procedural, basically. And there's a clear relationship between cause and effect. And so it's anything procedural, a lot of compliance stuff. It's basically all this straightforward kind of thing. So it could be updating a medical record. It could be running a hotel breakfast service. It could be daily plant operations. So simple doesn't mean like it's only a few steps or something, but simple means you do this and then you do this and you do this. So again, like I said, when in my GAPS model, I refer to this as the procedural stuff. So daily plant operations could have thousands of steps, but we know pretty much know what they all are, right? So those are our problems. And one of the challenges we have is everybody's trying to shove all of the skills into the simple box and have there be right answers for everything. And as we see, this is not the case. So complicated problems, they have, yeah, absolutely, Mark, 100%. Actually, what they're talking about is probably going to fit into this complicated space. So let me talk about this one real quick. This is solutions, but often require expertise or analysis to identify. So if somebody, again, we've got a lot of experience in the room here. If somebody comes to you and starts talking about a learning problem and they're explaining what they think is going on, what they need, you've got a little kind of decision tree in your head where you're going to go tick, 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 and you're going to then ask a question. And depending on the question, you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to discard this set of stuff and I'm going to come over here, and continue to ask questions. And if you really, really did the work, you could probably draw out your little decision tree of things. But the truth is, like, that's a pain in the ass and nobody wants to do it. Although this is my world now where I'm actually trying to do this in some cases. But this is complicated, which is you've seen so many of these over the years that the patterns have become very quick and very easy. And this is where the expertise builds up. And so you have solutions to a lot of the problems they're talking about. And then there'll be some stuff where you don't. But like in a lot of cases, you can be like, oh, we're just going to totally discard this chunk of stuff over here and focus over here because you've seen this like 37 times. And you know from experience that that's the direction people should go. And really, so expertise is gained through practice and exposure. And cause and effect can be recognized through expert experience. And so this is things where judgment's required. There's some variability of context, but expertise is really crucial. So like it might be playing chess, like, oh, somebody starts and you're like, oh, I know this play. This is, the Moravian, blah, 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 whatever, thing. And you immediately like lock into a set of patterns if you're an expert chess player where you have some pretty good guesses where this game is going to go. It might be something like medical research where it is complicated, but like we know the steps. We've been through lots and lots of research studies. We know we're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to do this. And some of the outcomes may vary, cause us to go in different directions, but we've got a really good framework for how we're going to work through this. In some cases, it's building consulting, things like that. But I have this expertise because I've seen so many examples, and I've worked through so many examples, and I have a lot of frameworks in my head. Now, when it comes time to take that and communicate it to somebody, so Mark, this is 100% where it's simple, because they've seen 7,000 of them, but they've lost the ability to necessarily explain it to somebody who's new, who's only seen two, that kind of thing. And we can move things from the complicated domain to the simple domain, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of effort. So if you were learning to fly a plane in 1924, you would go up with somebody who knew how to fly the plane and you'd kind of figure out what to do, and they'd give you the controls periodically and you'd sort of figure it out. You'd need one of those biplanes where two different people could be flying it, all this kind of stuff, right? But there weren't a ton of rules. There weren't a ton of things. If you learned to fly a plane in 2022, there are checklists, there are rules, there are guidelines, there are all of these kinds of things. And there's still a skill element that you have to develop and a feel for it and stuff like that. But a lot of this stuff is like boom, 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 boom. And the reason that we have all of those things is we took something that was complicated and we said in order to remove error from the system, i.e. we don't want planes to crash, we're going to have to be incredibly specific about what do we need to do and what do we not need to do. So you can do this. It's usually costly and difficult and not worth it unless people die if you don't. So one of the questions you always want to ask is it cheaper to just build more experts through repeated exposure, or is it cheaper to take this from the complicated domain and move it into the simple domain? Because, and it's not always cheaper, like cheap isn't, do people die less if we do this? Sorry, is this making sense? I want to make sure I'm not like going way too esoteric on this. Yeah, Air Force pilots love checklists, right? Anybody read Anders Ericsson's Peak? I'm going to spell his name wrong, but his book is very much focused on the expertise that you build up in the complicated domain. Thank you. Yeah, I knew I was going to get the number of R's and the number of C's and the number of S's wrong. Apparently I did it completely wrong, if Clark's right. So, okay. Yeah, so a lot of his research, so looking at the question of how many x-rays does a radiologist need to look at and find out about the outcomes before they develop that real expertise at looking at an x-ray and evaluating it for an outcome. Yeah, so right, yeah, absolutely, Andrew. The Air Force, military stuff, because they train so many people and they do so much of this, there's a lot of trying to surface this expertise and build it into practices and procedures and things like that. So you can take something that somebody used to do as a skill and you can proceduralize it as a way of making it more consistent, basically. And so that's part of where we are. So it's worth asking, am I dealing with a simple skill or am I dealing with a complicated skill? And the big question you want to think about if you're dealing with a complicated skill is how many case examples is this person going to need to see before they start to understand the pattern recognition of what they're looking at? So I can either do the thing where I proceduralize it, or I can do the thing where I just expose this person to lots and lots of case examples. Another example of this is I was working with a group that was trying to teach new people in healthcare facilities how to do root cause analysis. It was part of a bigger program, but one of the things they were trying to teach them was root cause analysis. And they were like, well, you could do 5 whys, you could do fishbone, you can do all these analysis types. And I'm like, great, how do they know when they're done with root cause analysis? How do they know when they found the root cause? And I had 12 experts in the room and they all just gave me a blank look and they said, well, you just kind of know. And I was like, fantastic, because that is not hard to explain to new people at all. But that was a case where they had seen so many of these that they had a good sense of where they were at a good stopping point. But that was not something that we could like spell out in bright line rules. It was something we were going to have to show people a lot of examples so that they could understand, do we keep going or do we keep going trying to get to root cause, or do we feel like we're at a pretty good place? Right. That was a case of complicated. Do you lose a necessary mental model when you make the complex procedural? I think you probably do. I mean, it depends. Obviously, like the rules for taking blood pressure don't encompass every single variation that you can ever have in the situation of somebody's blood pressure. But what they've done is they've kind of said, well, this gets us 98% of the cases if people do it this way. And we've got a certain error rate that we're okay with sometimes. And so I think there's, they certainly, Rich, I think that certainly people, if they move from, it's a little bit like, anybody have that feeling like you used to be way better at wayfinding before you had a GPS, right? That's something where that was, like wayfinding was probably a complicated skill. And then we all got GPSs and now we just follow it, right? But you lose a certain amount of troubleshooting ability when you move stuff from complicated to simple, because we're saying just do this, and you don't understand kind of necessarily the logic behind it or the decision making behind it as much. So yeah, I think you do lose some stuff when you move these things, but the question is what are you gaining? Are you gaining a lower error rate? Are you gaining more reliability? Are you gaining faster training time? So there's is an expert always going to still be maybe a little bit better in some cases? Yes. although they did this kind of stuff when they moved, people familiar with APGAR scores? It's the six item thing that you use to evaluate a newborn baby to tell if there's an issue or distress or things like that. That is a case where they took an expert level of expertise, midwives or doctors or whatever would be able to evaluate whether the baby was in some kind of distress. And they moved it into something where you look at these 6 variables, and if something's off with those, you know that there's probably action to take. So that's a case where they took a very complex or very complicated thing and moved it into a simple thing. And yet they increased the reliability of people spotting errors with newborns by moving it to that kind of checklist sorts of things. So yes, there are absolutely trade-offs. Rely on thinking policies and procedures can fix the problem. Yeah, you can flatten things. Yeah, I think you absolutely can if you're trying to do this. And I'm not saying that this should be the goal, is to move complicated to simple. I'm just saying that this is part of the dynamic, right? Because yes, there's absolutely a trade-off between growing experts versus making it procedural for people. Okay, I want to just sneak in the other 2 categories before we run out of time. So complex is there isn't a right answer, and a lot of it has to do with changing circumstances. So the example that I always give for this is what price should we charge for a particular product, right? So we may have some guidelines that hold steady, but a lot of times, if you look at the price of my book, it's currently about $40 on Amazon. It was $29 for a really long time. Sometimes it would drop down to 23. Sometimes there was one weird day where it was $9.99. I had the best-selling book in educational psychology that day. It was weird. But and this is the paperback. The Kindle price is a little bit more stable. But this idea of like, what's the right price for something? Like there isn't necessarily a clear answer, because the answer depends. If you're pricing a software product, you can maybe charge $500 for it on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, Google releases a free version that does almost exactly the same thing and blows your pricing model up. So like, how much should you charge for a product? Even if you go to an expert, they're not going to say $12.99. They're going to say, how do you test this with an audience? How do you do competitor analysis? How do you do A/B testing around pricing models to see what works best? It's a very complex thing, and the answer is it could be different tomorrow than it is today. So these are things where patterns emerge over time, where cause and effect you can sometimes tell afterwards, but you can't always anticipate it, right? So should we wear masks for COVID? Like that is a complex problem, right? And the answer changed. Even the best expertise answer has changed. Like my equation for it has shifted. I still wear one sometimes, but I don't wear one all the time. Like the right answer is it depends. Should we wear masks as a COVID preventative? And so this is things where there's just changing unstable circumstances. So it can get into things like innovation, unforeseen events, responding to volatility. These are places where there isn't a right answer per se. What instead we should focus on for these tends to be workshop style formats. So what's the best way to do user analysis? Well, whenever you're doing needs analysis or user analysis, you're like, here are basic questions, but then you may need to follow this conversation to see where it goes when you're doing a user interview, because you may find out all sorts of stuff that aren't encompassed in your original questions. And so that's a case where I would treat that as a complex problem, how to do user analysis. And I would give people methods to try out in some kind of environment and hopefully practice doing it a little bit so that they can see some of the complexity. But I wouldn't expect like, do this, do this, do this, do this. You're going to do these 8 steps in this order, and it's never going to vary, right? Because it is a complex problem. So like I said, design innovation, product pricing, executive leadership, like that's one of the challenges with a lot of these leadership things is we have right answers. And the truth is these are complex problems. And so there will be some right tending answers, but there will not be, this is the only way that you motivate a workforce, or this is the only way that you manage a company, or this is the only way that you handle, this particular situation or something like that. And the way that Dave Stone talks about this is a probe, sense, respond. I'm going to figure out how to gather some data in the world. I'm going to parse that data, and then I'm going to formulate a response to it. And that's fundamentally the activity that you're engaged in complex environments. There isn't a right answer. It doesn't matter how many times you see it. You're not going to be able to say on the 101st time that this is exactly what we need to do, no matter what happens, because the conditions are changing. And so the skill is being able to respond to those conditions and respond and adapt, basically. And then the last one, I'm going to have enough time to talk about chaotic. Cause and effect are unclear. You need to triage and act to establish order, pull things back to a stable situation. This is situations where I am going to have to act before I have all the information. So I cannot possibly know the right thing to do, but it doesn't matter because the situation is urgent enough. I'm still going to have to take action, and I'm going to have to adapt my approach as the information unfolds. But so how do you manage a global pandemic? How do you manage a cyber attack? How do you manage whatever? You have to like be able to triage. You have to be able to try to reestablish order in the system, but you will have to act with incomplete information. You will have to make decisions without having everything that you need to do. So it could be disaster, collapse, disaster response, cyber attack, financial crisis, all of these different kinds of things where I'm going to have to act with incomplete information. So I need triage methods. And from a learning point of view, you need to keep people from losing their cool in these situations. And so you're going to have to figure out, how am I going to build up your stress response so that you can still function once you're into these. I'm sure, Andrew, this is a thing in your world, right? Like how do you help people build up some stress control reactions, some stress, and so that when they're thrown into these highly chaotic situations, they can still function and they can still act. So these are some of the domains that I look at. And when we think about simple, most of our standard learning strategies work just fine for simple. It's the procedural stuff. We create learning experiences, we create support. Complicated, the big focus for me on that is exposure to case examples. So that I see more examples, I can see more and more examples of cases to start to make some judgment about it. Complex is very much a workshop format. I want to try stuff. I want to be able to try things in real world context, gather data, come back and practice analyzing it and responding to it. And then chaotic, the things I focus on there is, like I said, triage procedures and managing stress reactions, because you're in a highly volatile situation in that kind of case. So this is another step down when I've got a skill thing, is where does it sit? And the answer is never all one. Like pricing, there's probably some stuff that is simple or some stuff that's complicated, but you still have complex. So it's not like a skill gets put into just one bucket, but you do want to think about where do these all balance in, because your learning strategy is going to change depending on where the balance of these different domains are for a particular skill. All right, came skin in hot to the end of the session, but I'm happy to stick around for a minute if people have questions.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah.